Hello and welcome to this video on the life and legacy of George Washington, the first President of the United States. George Washington was born into a wealthy and influential family of English and American gentry. Along with Thomas Jefferson, he was one of the famous gentry of his time. Many people today criticize these men for being slave owners, but back then, slavery was considered a part of the free trade market, and our ancestors didn't have things like the US dollar, so they had to trade in order to survive. So that means that everything was for trade, even humans. Slavery was only able to be abolished because of the advent of national currencies and, more recently, cryptocurrencies. These people also could have just sat on their wealth and been selfish, but instead chose to pioneer movements in the best interests of the people. Washington had been serving in the Virginia militia and was appointed to a commission in the British Army in 1753 during the French and Indian War. He was eventually made the commander of Virginia's entire regiment, but despite his successful leadership, he was passed over for a promotion to colonel in the regular British Army. The position was instead given to a man named Thomas Dunbar, who had not seen any combat in the war. Washington was deeply disappointed and felt slighted by this decision. He wrote a letter to his brother, saying, "I have been posted and passed over, and over again, to my great mortification and vexation." This incident may have played a role in Washington's eventual decision to leave the British Army and return to Mount Vernon to settle down with his wife, Martha. It also likely fueled his growing discontent with British rule and contributed to his eventual involvement in the American Revolution. George Washington was not a revolutionary before the British acts violating American rights, but rather became involved in the revolutionary movement as a response to those acts. To explain in more detail, the British government passed several acts that were seen by American colonists as violations of their rights as British subjects. The first of these was the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, angering many who saw this as a restriction on their freedoms. Next came the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay a tax on printed materials such as newspapers and legal documents. This was followed by the Declaratory Act, which asserted the British government's right to tax the colonies without their consent. The Townshend Acts, passed in 1767, imposed new taxes on imported goods such as tea, glass, and paper. These acts led to widespread protests, including boycotts of British goods, and were met with resistance from many colonists, including George Washington. In 1770, British troops fired on a group of protesting colonists in Boston, killing several in an event that came to be known as the Boston Massacre. This incident further inflamed tensions between the colonists and British authorities. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, effectively cutting out colonial merchants. This led to the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists dumped British tea into the Boston harbor in protest. These actions, among others, led George Washington and many other colonists to join the revolutionary movement and fight for American independence from British rule, saying, "Custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway." The Revolutionary War continued with the Boston Siege, where British forces blockaded the city and imposed martial law in response to colonial resistance. This set the stage for further conflict, including the invasion of Quebec and the Battle of Long Island. In 1776, British forces arrived on Staten Island and Washington's army attempted to defend New York City. Despite their efforts, the Americans were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, leading to a devastating loss in the Battle of Long Island. The American Revolution started with a bang, but soon the British gained momentum, and the fight for freedom began to die down. George Washington and his Continental Army fought a series of battles against British forces in New Jersey. Washington moved his army into New Jersey in November 1776, following a string of defeats in New York. However, Washington faced significant challenges in New Jersey. Many New Jersey residents were loyalists, meaning they supported British rule and opposed the revolution. This made it difficult for Washington to gain the support he needed for his army. Additionally, his forces were constantly on the move and were often low on supplies, making it difficult to maintain morale and keep soldiers in the fight. However, he refused to give up hope and devised a plan to surprise attack the Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's success at Trenton led to another victory at Princeton, and the Patriot enthusiasm was reignited. But their struggles were far from over. By December 1777, Washington's army had dwindled from 11,000 to only 2 to 3,000 members due to a lack of food, clothing, and shelter, while the British were well quartered in Philadelphia. Men began to lose hope again and quit the effort. Washington pleaded to Congress for more resources to continue the fight for freedom. The tides turned in favor of the Patriots when France signed the Treaty of Alliance with America after Burgoyne's defeat, becoming the first world power to recognize America. The Siege of Yorktown was a decisive battle of the American Revolution. It took place in 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia, and was the last major battle of the war. The American forces, commanded by General George Washington, along with the French forces, commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau, successfully besieged the British army led by General Lord Cornwallis. The French fleet, commanded by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, defeated the British Navy and cut off Cornwallis' supply lines by sea. Washington and Rochambeau then marched their armies to Yorktown and began their siege, trapping Cornwallis and his men inside the city. The siege lasted for about a month, with the Americans and French bombarding the city with artillery and conducting several successful attacks on British positions. Cornwallis attempted to break out of the siege, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army to Washington. This victory was a turning point in the war, as it effectively ended British hopes of winning and led to negotiations for peace. The Siege of Yorktown is remembered as a defining moment in American history, and as one of Washington's greatest military achievements. After the war, Washington resigned from the army and returned to Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia. However, he was called to action again during Shays Rebellion, where he helped restore order and strengthen the government. Shays Rebellion was an armed uprising that took place in Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787. It was led by Daniel Shays, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, and a group of farmers and small business owners who were protesting against the state government's high taxes and oppressive policies. Many farmers had fallen into debt due to the post-war economic depression and were unable to pay their taxes. The rebellion highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States. It showed that the federal government was too weak to deal with domestic unrest and that there was a need for a stronger central government. This eventually led to the ratification of the Articles of Confederation and the establishment of the early United States. Washington's leadership and contributions to the American Revolution were recognized when he was elected as the first President of the United States. He worked tirelessly to build a strong, unified nation while also setting precedents for future presidents to follow. George Washington was a true pioneer for America. Despite facing incredible challenges and hardships, he never gave up hope and continuously fought for the freedom of the American people. He risked his life on the front lines during brutal winters, and he never attempted to take absolute power over the people, from slaves to the wealthy. While Washington owned slaves, it's important to remember that he only owned 114 of them, and he actively pushed the abolition of slavery in legislation. He also played a significant role in establishing the United States and laying the groundwork for a strong, central government. In short, you cannot watch NFL football, smoke big backwoods, play 2K, hit the club, say whatever you want, and shoot whatever you want, without recognizing the contributions and sacrifices of George Washington. He could have sat on his wealth and vacationed for life, but instead risked his life for the betterment of the American people. He is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of hope, perseverance, and leadership for all Americans. See you next time.